All right, nice. Hi, Luli. Welcome to my
Hey,
YouTube channel, I guess. It's nice to see you again.
yeah, nice to see you.
And so we were tweeting about writer's block, and it just seemed like a opportune reason to have a recorded conversation at last. And so I guess I wanted to ask you, what are you writing and what are you working on? What are you feeling?
Uh, so I would say that like my problems with writer's block have kind of come up in like different situations. And so
Mhm.
there's part of me that wants to say, well, it's not just now what I'm doing now in particular.
Sure.
Um, but I'm also like not sure if that's even true because basically what happens is when I sit down to write a YouTube video, then things go kind of wonky or haywire or something.
Mhm.
Uh Yeah, I was curious to also like I can dive into that, but I was curious to hear like have you had experience with writer's block in the past? Or has that never
Yes.
been an issue?
I mean, I would say it's always an issue. It's so for me, it's so I've been writing all kinds of stuff for a very long time. But it hasn't always been like effortless and sometimes it is. Sometimes it just pours out of me. Usually when there is some inciting incident or some specific context that just makes me want to say something. And I usually find that I was already doing the prep beforehand. So but I have so one of my most memorable struggles with it was at work in like 2015 or 2016. So at my last company, when I was working as like a marketing guy, and I was like, my job was to write for the company blog, which I took a lot of personal pride in, which I don't think is super common. I feel like the people that I spoke to in my industry, a lot of them were like, oh, just write whatever for like, this company stuff, like doesn't really matter. And I was like, if it's got my name on it, I want to make sure that it's really good. And we were writing, as we were, me and my boss, we were kind of trying to come up with this very comprehensive, very all-encompassing guide. So it was about referral marketing. So we're just like all of the things that go into like making a referral program work. So it's very nerdy, very nitty-gritty details. And I was just like, oh, I put this burden on myself that I'm supposed to convey everything that's ever been said and ever been thought about the topic. And I drove myself insane about it. Like for I
And in
was
those days you didn't have Chat GPT to do it for you.
That's true, yeah. And so I would write multiple drafts, struggle with it, agonize over it. And now in retrospect, I realized, oh, I wasn't being fair to myself. I wasn't being realistic about what like a human scoped piece of writing could be. So since then, I think I have tried to be more reasonable. Although even then, like with my second book, Introspect, I had similar issues. Like I'm trying to condense everything everything that has ever been said, which is an impossible task, but I was trying to do that. And I do feel like part of the excitement of writing for me is trying to kind of bite off more than I can chew. But like there's this push and pull between what is manageable, doable, and what is kind of grand. I mean, but that's one form of it. There's
So
multiple.
what was the specific like thing that happened with the writer's block? Like so you sat down, what
Mhm.
you like started writing and then like what happened?
With the guide, I would write out. So I can get words out. That's pretty easy for me. So I can just ramble. I do this thing which is like assume it's low quality, assume it's a shitty draft to be thrown away. So I'll just blah 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 blah. Like sometimes I'll even start writing kind of gibberish sentences as I start, and then I'll like I'll have like a first person's voice. Like I know that didn't just make any sense. Anyway, in with regards to the thing that I'm trying to say, and then I'll keep writing, and then when there's a flow, I can then delete the first half. That's what I usually do. But in the case of the guide that I was stuck with, I realize now in retrospect, I oh wait, that's not what you asked. You asked what exactly happens. So I keep writing and I look at it and it doesn't feel right. And now I have the sense to realize that, oh, nothing would have felt right because I had not conveyed my expectations to myself about what I wanted. Or I had like these unrealistic expectations. And so now with like 5 to 7 years more experience, I would kind of sit on my own shoulder and be like, hey, what are you trying to do here? What are you trying to say? Who are you trying to say it to? What is the expectation of the reader at the start, and what is the expectation for them at the end? If you and in like I think in advertising they call this like the brief, or like in multiple industries they call it like you have to have a very clear brief about what you want to achieve, because if you don't have that, then it just creeps and
Yeah.
the scope expands. Then you
So when you were sitting and you were looking at the page and you had just written some stuff and it didn't feel right, like what was that not feeling right? Was it that like, oh, I haven't conveyed the thing I want to convey, or like, oh, it doesn't look like it's like a nice piece of writing, or what specifically was that?
Right. So I don't worry so much about like the polish of the writing. Like I can always add that later, or like in like post editing, final stage editing. But it's the middle stage thing of am I laying out the right building blocks to convey the vision that I want? And am I bringing the reader through a series of events that I want? And so like with the referral guide thing, it's like I'm trying to teach them stuff about some concepts, but it feels kind of too technical, or it feels so I tried a few different introductions. One felt too technical, one felt too um kind of childlike in a way that seemed a bit condescending. Like because it's for like professional audience, it just kind of trialing and erroring. It's not a phrase. Just trying out different things to see what worked. And because I didn't have a clear sense of the compromises I was going to make, I was trying every single possible thing. And it was a lot of them were pretty far away from what I actually wanted. So yeah.
So so now like now when you're in that situation, you're on your own shoulder and you say, well, it's not meant to feel good at this point because like you haven't got like the clarity of what like content, audience, and something other. Is that
Yeah,
and then what are the actual steps that you take, like when you kind of notice like, I feel bad about this writing, it's not kind of what I want, what do you like specifically do then, like what are the steps?
Yeah, so I have many so yeah, I'm now much better at this, and my approach is actually I start new drafts. Like I and sometimes I text myself, sometimes I text a friend. Sometimes I'll be like, hey, can you listen to me? I'm just gonna ramble at you what I am writing about. And there's something about that frame of explaining something to a friend. Like I've really found that, let's say I've written a draft and I don't like it, I can like text a friend and or colleague or whatever and be like, hey, I wrote a draft, I'm not very happy with it. Let me explain to you what the essay is supposed to be about. And then the words that come out of my hands after that end up being very, very close to what the piece actually should be. Because I think there's something about like prioritizing in conversation. Like, okay, the most important thing you need to know is X. Because I think when you're writing and there's no like audience feedback, it's tempting to like start from like, there's a joke that's like, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to first invent the universe. Like similarly, it's like, oh, to tell you the story of X, I have to first explain A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Not necessarily. There's some amount of skipping and if you do manage to explain.
Sorry to cut in, but one of the problems I have with that is that when I then try to explain like all of the previous things, I then feel like I'm over explaining, or like, these things are obvious actually, and then I don't know like which things to explain and which things that I shouldn't explain.
Yeah, that is the challenge, right? It is like a kind of information presentation challenge. And there's this great interview with the science writer Carl Zimmer. I read him around the time when I was struggling with this, and he wrote books like about like the discovery of the human brain, and like all these really sprawling, hundreds of years of story and science and tech and all kinds of stuff. And he said, sometimes to understand what happened, you might have to research some obscure thing. Like the example he gave, I think, was like, to understand the results of some chemistry experiment, you might have to read up about crystallography or some specific obscure thing. And you might then feel like, oh, I've done all this work to make sense of this, and I should convey it to the reader so that they can understand it too. But if you try that then it just becomes unreadable. It's way too much material. And so there's an act of faith required it's quite like there's like spiritual, not spiritual, but well, I semi-spiritual implications about like trust and openness and vulnerability even, right? Like, so he says the point of all the research and reading is for you to know what the story is, and you can never convey the entire story. So you have to convey like a shadow of what the story is, and you have to trust that the reader will be curious enough and interested enough that if they want to know more, they can figure it out, and you might have like an appendix or further reading or whatever. But in the piece itself, all of the research that you do should just be to help you be clear about what the most important things are within the brief or the context. You know, so if it's like a 1,000-word essay, that's how much space you have, and if it's a longer thing, then you adjust accordingly. But yeah, I've tried to carry that with me.
Yeah, so when you're stuck, then your go-to thing is to explain it to a friend.
Yeah,
Is
it
that right?
really, yeah. And sometimes even I've done this on my YouTube channel where I'm stuck with a writing, with some kind of writing, and so I'll go and make a video about it, and it's like stuff. And then when I watch the video or I read the transcript, I'll be like, oh, you know, there's some phrasing and some like word choices or order of there's something about the way that it comes out that just feels I'll know it when I feel it. There'll be something like a click, like a, oh yeah, that's the phrase or that's the thing. And yeah, I think it's very helpful to be willing to, and I don't know if this is different for different people based on like their personality type or whatever, but like um the more comfortable I've gotten kind of starting over from scratch, the better my writing has become. Like I feel like I used to agonize over trying to update a draft to make it better. But I find that if I write one draft and I'm willing to be like abundance mindset about it and be like, let's just for fun, right? Like I think in cinema they like let's just do another take for fun, right? Let's just do another, just see how it goes. And like so I do a quick sketch of another draft with feeling this time, I guess. And it almost always goes better in the subsequent draft if I have that feeling.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting what you say about like just messaging a friend, because so one of the articles that I actually got writer's block on, it started out as a message to a friend, and then I was like, this is getting kind of long, maybe I should just make this into a blog post. And so I moved it to a text file, and then I continued writing it, and then I started kind of running out of steam, and then then I took a break, and it was the next day, and I came back to it, and then suddenly everything was like wading through a kind of thick mud or something like that.
Right.
Ironically, this was a piece about Alexander technique, and then the thing that I used to get out of the like wading mud was in fact the thing that I was writing about, which was the awareness expansion and all of this and non-doing and that kind of stuff.
You know, I've come to believe that these are the hardest things to write about. Like it's almost like, and you know what? I don't doubt in the slightest that you are good at the thing that you're trying to write about. And it's almost I've come to believe that it's like an impediment. Like being good at the thing that you're trying to describe makes it almost harder to describe it. And it's almost like, so yeah, my you know, I've like my second book was called Introspect, and it's basically like between 2016 and 2019, like I just made a lot of progress on like my personal emotional well-being, everything. I was doing horribly before, and I was doing great afterwards. And in conversations with strangers, DMs with kids, whatever, I find that people ask me for help and I'm able to help them really, really well. And I'm like, oh, if I'm helping so many people, I should just write a book, and then I can share that with other people, and that's going to be great. And the process of writing the book was agonizing to the point where I was starting to get miserable. And then I'm like, oh my God, I'm trying to help people, and now I'm the one that needs help. Like I just like spiraled. Like I was doing great before I started writing.
I wonder to what extent that's a thing of being good at it versus like introspection itself is just a very sort of heavy thing that you kind of need breaks from to like interact with the real world. Because like, so when you said oh, you're good at that, and so maybe it's hard, I wrote that article when I had like no training, like I kind of was just learning the ideas, and so they were actually kind of very fresh. Also, I find that the things that I know kind of very well, like there are some things that I could just write in my sleep. and I could just kind of regurgitate the things, and I could just kind of do that.
Right.
The tricky thing is finding a new exciting angle on it.
Yes.
Like
Yes.
something that promotes me, like makes me
Yes.
want to write.
This is my current issue, right? I have all of these like Twitter threads that people say they like, and I would like to have essays of those threads, but I do not feel like writing them because it's not fun. It's not fun for me to do this like transcription of, oh, here's a thread and I'm going to copy it over and like try to edit it. Like that does not excite me. So like my challenge for myself is how do I find a fresh angle on familiar material in a way that makes me excited to work on it, right? Yeah, no, circling back to the thing about when it's new as well, I think to be more precise, it's not so it's about the writing about recursive things. I think is difficult. Like, so when the thing that you're trying to write about involves paying attention to things, there's something because like writing almost functions as like a finger that you're pointing at stuff. Like look at this and then look at that and then look at this, and then if you're trying to point the finger at itself and say this is how you should be pointed, it's just like it's almost like a I think if you do it in like programming or like math, there's like a fill function pointing to a function. The recursion just breaks something, and
How does that fit with? So sometimes I'm doing journaling about like my feelings or something. I'm trying to think. There's like, what is that? There is a sort of self-reflective thing, and if I'm on my own and doing it for myself, then it works.
Yeah, same.
But then if I'm doing it for other people, like, well, no, if I'm doing it for generic other people, like the public,
right,
then I run into problems. If I'm doing it for a specific other person, then I basically never run into problems.
Right.
I don't know,
yeah.
what's your experience?
Yes, exactly the same thing. And I think, well, again, so there is no such thing as a generic public person, right? So the public is an assemblage of many different, like our image of many different people. And like you want to give and any piece of advice you can think of, there's like somebody for whom it'll be good and somebody for whom it'll be bad. And yet you can't caveat, if you caveat every single thing that you say, then that makes for like tedious reading. And so yeah, it's just so very much what happens when writing to a friend, for example, is you do privilege one frame over like a broad mass frame, which ends up being very difficult to do a good job of. And I was reading when I was stuck in my book, I was reading a bunch of other books that I like. I'm looking at my shelf, and very often, so focusing is one of them that I read I think I read very late in my book. And what else do I have? There was, I think, How to Win Friends and Influence People is another one. And what these authors do very well is that they basically tell stories about individual people. And when you tell a story about an individual person, it's easy to see how something that worked for them might not necessarily work for everyone else, but you can see how it worked for them, right? So like somebody who needs to, somebody who might, let's say, have too much they overthink things too much, right? And so they need like advice on like letting that go, whereas somebody else might like not consider anything when they act and they need the opposite suggestion. And if you try to make a general statement about the appropriate level of consideration, that's very difficult. But if you tell those two stories like back to back, that really kind of conveys everything you need to convey. So some of it is that it's sort of like choosing concrete, specific things to talk about.
Yeah, one of the things that I was thinking when you were speaking earlier about like the different the writer's block that you had and the different things that you tried and everything, and it kind of struck me because you said like a bunch of stuff like, consider the audience, consider this thing, all of that stuff, and I was like, cool, okay, these are all like different pieces of advice that I've heard for how to get out of writer's block, and they apply to some people and they don't apply to other people. And then there's also a question of like, maybe they do apply to you but you haven't actually done them, or like there's a kind of like I've had like dozens of ideas about how to get over writer's block, and then the last thing that worked for me was that I was doing this course in which every day you would just do 7 to 10 minutes of free writing. It was just like anything, like, you know, morning pages, journaling, like whatever, like free writing, truly free writing,
Right.
which is slightly different from journaling, because journaling can be like more, you know, specific about you. And just doing this every day kind of made like the act of writing easy. And it was like the sitting down, and, you know, I've got a timer and I've got a, you know, time to do it and everything, and I need to do it because it's part of this broader context that I care about. And then a lot of the other things, like when I'm at the keyboard and I think like, I should try one of my ideas that I've had to resolve writer's block, and then like maybe sometimes I do that and it kind of works, but it's still kind of janky. But I guess then it's more like maybe that wasn't actually the right solution. It's like writing is such a thing from the subconscious, and so I think that having a particular person in mind is really useful, because it tunes all of your subconscious sort of like, what's the meaning exactly. So I don't know, there's kind of a question that I'm wrestling with in the back of my mind, which is something like, there are all of these bits of advice, different bits of advice work for different people. People actually have very different problems when it comes to writer's block. And then there's the actual doing of the advice in the first place, which might be a motivational issue or something.
Yeah, it's very dynamic. And so even now, I feel like I feel like I'm so much better at this than I used to be, but that doesn't mean like I don't get stuck. I just resolve it better, I guess, right? Like, so, and I witnessed musicians talking about this. Now, and my musical ability it's all right, but when I see the masters do it, what I've come to believe is that, and based on what they say, and it seems true, that they are so comfortable making mistakes that they don't even think of them as mistakes anymore. Like, if they meant to play like a G and they accidentally play a G flat, they don't think, fuck, I made a mistake. They think a G flat happened, I'm gonna slide it to the G. It happens so fast, it doesn't even feel like a mistake. It just, it's like
you have a video about this, and it's one of my favorite
exactly
videos you've done. Yeah.
And that changed my life. Like, just witnessing that, I'm like, oh, it's the freezing and flinching that designates a mistake as the mistake, right? And like, that has been continuing to kind of echo through my entire ontology, I would say. Like, just like, a mistake is not a mistake, a stuckness is not stuckness until you're like embarrassed about it, and then you don't want to talk about it, and then that prolongs the stuckness. There's all of those dynamics. And yeah, so my current situation with my essays, I'm able to write up drafts very easily every day. I can just like freestyle about some topic, but my personal threshold for publishing, my standards for publishing has gotten higher and higher. Like, I just want to, if it doesn't like, hit a spot very nicely, I'm like, oh, that was fun to write, but I'm not going to publish that. And so, is that writer's block? I think that's just having high standards. I think it's like,
yeah.
Whereas I have had times where I'm sitting and I'm thinking and I'm like, nothing is really coming to me. And I find that when that happens, so recently I've been like reflecting on all of that. A lot of what happens when I do that is I'm trying to write something good. And there is this very ironic trap where trying to write something good is like this not blinding, but so this narrowing of focus, that like all the good writing happens, and this I found to be true. I have so much experience that this is true. All the good writing happens when you have some excitement or some curiosity and you start going, and then you're almost not paying attention and you take like interesting shortcuts and interesting side observations, and that's where all the beautiful good stuff is. Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I so one of my guesses about this is that the writing, like when you're trying to write something good, part of your brain is dedicated to, how is this going to be, like, how is this going to look like, what is this going to look like in the end, like, does this thing that I've currently written 3 sentences for match my ideal of the 3 sentences at the end. And all of that thinking is taking up like effort and clock cycles and everything that usually would be dedicated to actually like doing the writing. And
Yeah.
it's you know, to take the Alexander technique, it's a form of doing, like you're using your
Mm.
kind of conscious brain to do the wrong task. Whereas really what you want is to have something that is free, such that like you've got like the kind of like basic like directive of like write this thing, and then your, you know, your subconscious or whatever can just like flow and do stuff, and not be dedicated to like, oh, I can only produce ideas that meet this standard, because then it gets all narrow.
Yeah, that's very true. I remember I was once kind of doing like a woe is me thread on Twitter about struggling with my book. And one of my friends, Maria, she was like, "Well, what would it be nice? What would it be like if it was effortless and if it was beautiful and all of those things?" And the word that came to my mind for me is that, oh God, I want to like luxuriate in the writing. Like I know that experience, and in that moment when I was so frustrated with myself, like that was the furthest thing from my experience. Like in that moment, I'm like, oh, all the words are wrong, all it's everything about everything is just there. And then I tried to have this, and it was a friend asking, what if it was nice? What if it was effortless? And then I almost wanted to cry at the moment where I realized, like, oh shit, like I want to enjoy myself. I want to have fun. I want to really, and it's a kind of performance pressure, I guess, that we put on us. I put on myself, and I'm guessing lots of people put on themselves. So it's probably helpful to, and again, like different people, different prompts at different times, blah blah blah. But like, yeah, I think it's fun to have whatever you think your serious attempt is, and then like at some point, like take a break from that and be like, okay, let's do like a goofy, silly, weirdo version of it. And so one of the things I did was I tried re-summarizing my book in purple italic all caps, like shouty voice. And there's something about writing in all caps that really shakes off the like solemnity. And then when I found that like 80% of the sentences,
Yeah, I think Rob Hardy did the same, but with
Mhm.
all lowercase.
Yeah,
Like just
same thing.
started
Like just
publishing in all lowercase. Yeah.
yeah, it really helps. It really helps to just face the whole thing from a different angle. I think that's helpful.
How
But again,
much do
yeah.
you think? How
Go
much
ahead.
do you think writer's block has to do with things like imposter syndrome?
Oh man, I have this elaborate theory about imposter syndrome. I don't really like the phrase. I feel like it is there are certain phrases that are almost designed to perpetuate the problem because I feel that they don't represent the problem accurately. But I mean, so imposter syndrome is typically when people say that, what they mean is that, I don't feel like I'm good enough, or I don't feel like I'm supposed to be here. I don't feel like blah blah blah.
Or I have to prove myself.
Right. And I think that, and so some people then ask, how do I solve it within myself? Like, and I wrote a book called Introspect, and I will say you cannot introspect your way into solving an imposter syndrome feeling, because the imposter syndrome feeling is not it's not a single solitary thing. Like again, like there are clues in the phrase. It's the idea that I don't feel like I belong in this space with like other writers, for example. And the solution to that, or the approach to solving that problem, is you need to develop an understanding of the interior of other writers. So no amount of introspection will give you insight into the interiority of other writers. Like you have to know how other
Isn't
writers are.
isn't isn't that assuming that imposter syndrome is sort of like basically a correct stance to take, and that you do have to like rank yourself or something?
No, I mean, it's not about ranking. It's more of like, um, so I found that the solution to, like, I mean, I don't know about that, but what I can say is that the more I kind of learned about the struggles of like much more established and much more successful creators, like, so there's this great Twitter thread of Hayao Miyazaki, who's like an animator at the absolute kind of cutting edge of his field, best in the world kind of thing. And his creative process, he's just struggling. He's like, oh, this doesn't look right. I'm at the limit of my ability. I've only written one page. This is not good enough. And you see him struggling, and you're like, that is what, I mean, maybe there's an easier way to do it, but that gave it's almost, it's semi-ironic, right? Like me witnessing a creative that I can respect and admire struggling and being okay with the struggling, made me kind of okay with my struggling. Like I feel like
So it's more like what are the expected mindsets, which
right.
is actually quite similar to your writer's
Mis-
block.
yes.
Because like the whole thing is like, this feels kind of wrong, but it's okay, or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah,
And then
yeah,
it's the
yeah.
same thing.
Yeah. So it's okay. So it shouldn't be this feels off. I'm a failure. Right. I can't it's more of like this just feels off. It's frustrating, but this is the puzzle that I'm trying to solve. Right. So there's something, so that's part of it. Um but I mean I'm not sure if that's what you were looking to hear. That's just me going soapboxing my
No,
own
it's
rant of
interesting. Yeah.
um
I do want to talk about like my specific kind of
okay.
current writer's block to see if we can
Mhm.
figure out, because
Let's
I
try.
have one of these great solutions that I wrote down
Mhm.
and I have not tried yet, and so I
Okay.
don't know if it's an actual solution or not.
Let's try it.
Um, so the actual thing that happens is that I have like a title in mind, and I sit down and I like write the title, or I write the basic, the keywords or something, and then my mind just kind of
Mm.
uh and it's kind of, yeah, what happens, it's sort of like I don't know where to begin. Like there's a kind of like, maybe I will write down like, well, I could say this, and like, well, I'll do an outline, but then the kind of the motion of actually writing the sentences feels difficult, or like I'll write one sentence and then I'm like, that's not quite the right
Mhm.
anything.
And what's your suggest? Yeah.
Yeah, so my current guess about what's happening is that because I'm doing it for a public audience, I'm thinking like all of the ways that it could be like wrong, it could be criticized, it could be not like fitting with that.
Mhm.
Also, like, okay, my previous theory was like, I'm thinking about too broad of an audience and I need to think about like, one person, and
Mhm.
then it will be okay.
Mhm.
And that sort of worked.
Mhm.
um but I suspect the fundamental thing is that I'm thinking way too much about what this is eventually going to go to, like it's going to be a YouTube script or it's going to be a blog post or something, rather than like actually thinking about the ideas. Like all of
Right.
my thoughts are kind of this meta thing on instead of the content. And like and I feel like almost like I haven't really been engaging with the content in a while, like the types of things that I want to talk about. Like I haven't read a book on the subject in a while. And so maybe the thing is like actually doing the learning research, like making it fresh for me, and really engaging with the content level ideas, and then not even worrying about like where it's going to go up, where it's going to go in the end. I don't know. So that's my current theory. What do
Wait,
you,
but so
what
what was
diagnosis, doc?
no, but so what what's your wait, so you describe what you think the problem is, right? So what do you think you should do to solve it? Or what do you think you're gonna do, basically?
Yeah, my guess is like pick the topic, and then instead of jumping into writing, like do like filling my brain with the type of stuff that I can then put onto the page, instead of just like assuming I kind of already know it and I just need to like put whatever's in my brain onto the page. There's a thing, so in artists often will look at art, will like consume content and stuff to get inspiration, which it's like refueling the tank. And so if you have not refueled the tank lately, then you're not going to be, you're running on fumes. So
Yeah. I'm my suggestion is partially that. Like I do kind of regret the amount of time I spent working on a book while not reading books. And I think for me, and I don't know if it's true for everyone, so like I didn't want to read books that were similar in topic because I didn't want to be like, oh, I'm like remixing someone else's ideas. In the context of what I was working on, I wanted it to be kind of like these are my thoughts, sort of. But what I would advise myself, like from 2 years ago, to do is to read any book, like so even like unrelated books that I like so I'm working on nonfiction. I would recommend choosing to read maybe some fiction or maybe some, and the point of that is really to immerse yourself in the vocabulary and the grammar. Like so I was reading tweets as I was writing my book, and then I go on Twitter, and then I'm writing my book and go on Twitter. And I love Twitter, but it's you prime
it
yourself
broke
to,
my ability to write. I swear I could write before
yeah,
Twitter, and now I'm just so used to writing in this kind
yeah,
of way.
it's a different skill set. I mean, you can switch, but it takes some like training, like I don't want to say training. It's like muscle memory. You have to kind of so you should be reading paragraphs in order to write paragraphs. And the skill of writing a good Twitter thread and the skill of writing a good paragraph or like a good ending to a chapter is substantially different. And I have found that reading a chapter here and there of some of the other books that I've had, they then kind of inspire me to be like, oh, that's interesting how he did that. I think I would do it a bit differently, but I know what I would do. So it's kind of like, think of it almost as like so there's like a reply game dynamic here, even though you're not directly replying to whatever it is that you're reading. Uh, yeah, like seeing other people's material in the domain that you care about, I think has a way of, and so like one kind of funny extreme version of this is a good way to write something is to look for something that pisses you off in that domain. So like if you want to write about, I don't know what's on my list. One of the things I want to write is about like being serious at a craft or being serious in a pursuit about something. So like if I'm not feeling like writing it, I can like look up a thing that annoys me. So I have some screenshots somewhere, but just like and this is described as like Cunningham's law, right? Like the way to get the right answer is not to ask for the right answer, but to post the wrong answer, and then someone will correct you. And this kind of works internally as well. Like look for someone. So you're never gonna write something perfect, but you can write something that's like less bad than a thing that annoys you. That's one angle of it. But the thing that I was gonna say at the start of all of this was my recommendation to myself when I'm in the position that you're in. Like, so I do have a bunch of titles that I like, and I've made progress on some, but not on others. And the thing about the ones that I have made progress on, what I do is it's kind of the same thing as text a friend. Like I do like meta commentary on it. Like so I'll write in first person to myself, I guess. Like, so the title of this essay is quote in other words. And the reason I think this is a good title is because, well, I think it's funny, I think it's this, I think it's that. And I'm not going to use any of these. Like the first paragraph that comes out, I'm not going to use it. But there's something about how you start explaining the thing, and then as you just keep going, and if you go pretty fast, you kind of get into the excitement of the thing. And then like the explanation part kind of, it's like scaffolding that can fall off, and then you can edit it out afterwards. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, I've done that sometimes. When you're saying about like consuming the media that you're going to then produce in, so I've been consuming a lot of YouTube videos. However, a YouTube video is the finished product.
Yeah, so you technically
where there's like editing and everything, where it's not like I haven't been consuming scripts.
Yes.
I guess
so
that would be the equivalent.
That would be closer to ideal. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Actually, so asking GPT, hey, write me a YouTube script, and then just kind of seeing, I don't know, that there's something to kind of seeing like, oh yeah, you can just like throw down a bunch of words.
Right. And again, it's like the ways in which it's not quite right can kind of like, when you see it, oh, I wouldn't do it that way. I would tweak it. I would make it more that. And those little corrections end up being your voice.
With the just like putting down words thing. So when I was doing the 7 to 10 minutes of free writing every day, the thing which always ended up being like 15 minutes, because like I just enjoyed a 15-minute chunk, but I had a minimum of 7 minutes, but then I was amazed to find that even if I wasn't like really saying anything, I could write like 900 words in 15 minutes. Like 900 words, like that's a full thing.
It is.
Okay, the words are not the right words, but at least there are words there.
Yeah, that's it's phenomenal. Like we really underestimate our own power, I think. Like when we are in the right context or with the right impulse starting, it really seems to me, if I were to advise myself, which I should, it would be like really, it's like more free writing is never hurts, right? Unless
I wonder if it's something around like confidence, or just like completely taking for granted that like you're great, you're going to produce great, or you're going to produce like there's a sort of because I'm kind of thinking like why did it matter that I wrote 900 words and that felt good even though they were the wrong words? And I think it was because it contradicted some idea of something like, oh, I'm never gonna do this, like 1,000 words is so much, like how am I gonna make my deadlines, like all of this sort of stuff. And so there's a way that it kind of contradicts that narrative.
Beautiful. There's this great anecdote in The War of Art, which if you haven't read, you should check it out. It's really
I
great.
have, yeah. Yeah, it's
And
good.
so he talks about the time where he hadn't been he wrote like a couple of crap pages on the typewriter after like 2 weeks of being depressed and just low energy, tired. And then he said after he wrote those 2 pages on the typewriter, which were crap, and he like trashed it he threw it away in the bin. He then felt like energized and went and did his dishes and all of that. And I remember thinking that is so under theorized in like our modern, just like we don't discuss that model much. I mean, okay, maybe amongst our friend group, I think there's
Sorry,
some
which model?
just this idea of like motivation and energetic state. So I don't know what's the right phrase to use, but the point is, people seldom say, "Oh, if you haven't done the dishes and you're struggling, go and write 2 pages of nonsense on your typewriter, and then you'll be fine." Like you don't see that suggested. But in that specific case, that was the solution to his problem. And probably it doesn't generalize to everybody's situations, but just knowing that that kind of thing is possible, I think makes things more exciting.
So there's a thing about like discomfort and writing even when it's uncomfortable, or there's a sort of like kind of what you notice is that you had a bad feeling and that actually that was okay at this stage, or like actually like that was recognizing something, or like actually at that point you can come in with a different thing. You don't have to keep going, okay, these are two different things. So like one of the things I've been thinking about lately is
No, so what are the two things again?
yeah, so okay, so one of the things I've been thinking about lately was non-coercion, and when I'm not going to coerce myself to do like my work, then becomes a thing where you don't do anything and you live in misery. And so sometimes like doing something that has a hump to get over, like that there's a hump, it's uncomfortable, but like you're okay with that discomfort. And then sometimes continuing to write or continuing to do the thing through the discomfort actually makes things worse and then makes you close down.
That's
And
true.
I'm trying to figure out like when it's one versus the other.
Hmm. My Well, I tend to, again, I guess different personalities is different. For me, I tend to just not do it. I do have phases where I'm just like,
I think you and me and the rest of Teapot.
probably, yeah, I'm just like, yeah, if I'm not going to do it, I'm not. So you can find on my Substack, I have this whole, I was stuck for a while and then I wrote a whole essay titled I Don't Wanna. And it's just like, I don't want to do it. Even if you could tell me that I could write something amazing, but I would have to suffer to do it, I don't want to do it. Like the world
How do
can't.
you
Mhm.
how do you like not just be constantly distracted and then never do anything? Like how is it
It's
that you still
happened.
like produce a ton of stuff though?
It's
Because you're like
happened.
the producer guy.
Well, I have. I mean, I do feel like I get distracted quite a lot actually, but yeah. So I feel like that's important to honor. Like I do get distracted. I do like very often I set out with some intention, and then along the way I get distracted by something, and I'm doing something completely different. I think what helps is that some of my distractions have turned out to be very fruitful, and so I've come to I feel like I've designed my life in a way that allows me to get beautifully distracted in some ways that might not be satisfied. It delays my book or it delays my essays or whatever, and that's kind of embarrassing. But I've now communicated that expectation to everyone in my life. So like all my friends know not to take all my like, oh, my essay's gonna come out tomorrow. They're like, yeah, yeah, Visa, sure. And I mean, I trust that they still love me, but they know that, oh, Visa says tomorrow probably means next week, something like that. And would it be nicer if I could make better predictions? Yeah, but it's not nearly as important to me as making sure that if I get distracted, I try to honor the distraction as best as I can. So it used to be like, oh, if I wanna play a video game, I would binge play like all the way through the night. It's terrible. I realize now in retrospect that was like, you know, not it's like trauma related stuff maybe. But so recently I noticed like even yesterday I just felt like I'm doing some I'm making progress on my notes, sorting stuff out, and I just feel like playing a video game. And I played it for like 20 minutes and it was fun. And I did have thoughts like from the game, like about aesthetics that's probably gonna go into one of my essays. So it's like I got distracted, but I enjoyed that and I honored that in a way, and not being mean to myself about it kind of allowed me to collaborate with that guy. And so later on, at some point, I'm going to write an essay about aesthetics that has something to do with video games, and people will be like,
Nice.
"Oh, how are you so productive?" It's
have you ever had the problem of now you're playing video games because you've got one eye out for like, what can I make content out of this? Have you ever gone into that?
That's my whole life. That's my whole
Yeah.
Borges, Borges, he has a quote that's like, "Oh man, an artist is working even when he's dreaming," and he says it in a very poetic and beautiful way. And I do think I have that. There's a part of me that never quite fully relaxes. But
does it feel tense, or does it ever like ruin the enjoyment of the game?
No, so I had a good time playing the game and simultaneously thinking about aesthetics. So it wasn't like I have to.
I feel like that there are kind of two different things. There's one where you are actually more engaged with the game because you're thinking about this and that and how
it's
and,
so
and
beautiful.
whatever.
Everything's connected.
And then there's a version of like looking out for things that are like, oh, I could use this, like, and then it's a kind of a more closed down, sort of unpleasant, sapping your creative energy out of it, ironically, because you're it's the same thing as the writer's block, because when you're thinking like, I can only write good sentences, then you're only producing like a very small number of sentences, whereas actually you need like this kind of broad thing where you can like write anything, or like you can experience anything, or you can do anything in the game.
Oh, you know what's one of my favorite, that just reminds me, because you said I have to write a good thing. I once wrote a really good essay on my word vomits blog, which wasn't supposed to be a good essay blog. So when you try to write bad stuff on purpose, so like one of my advice, I'm skipping all over the place. I wrote a thing called Letter to a Young Songwriter, because someone had emailed me, I think, and it was just the right question for me to pour my heart out. And I'm not even a good songwriter still, but like one of the things I suggested was like, try to write the worst song you can. Because when you're trying to write a good song or make a good anything, you are going to be constrained by, one is your expectations, and like, so you're not going to allow yourself to try things that you think are not good. And your model of what is good is itself kind of limited. So you're like double or triple constrained when you're trying to make something good, which is why it's hard. But when you try and make something silly or funny or bad, just humor comes into the picture, and you mean like it's difficult to make something uniformly bad. So if you challenge yourself and be like, okay, I'm gonna try and write the worst possible version of this piece, or like there's some prank that I don't know. I think maybe it activates like a trickster part of the brain or something. Like it's just like you start laughing to yourself about, and once you have laughter, you have engagement. I think you have something fun, you have something interesting. So yeah, that's one of my favorite prompts. Like, what if this? Malcolm always says, "What if we made it good?" And I'm like, "What if we made it bad, like on purpose?" Because then you can possibly flip it, right? And I've also seen this, like if someone's feeling uncomfortable, like just having a bad day or whatever, and you're thinking, how can I make this better? And they're like, almost, and there's a part that's like, fuck you, you're dishonoring my pain or whatever. But then you say, how could you make things worse right now? Like oh, I pour a bucket of water over my head, like then I'll be wet and gross. Like, oh, so you're thinking about like physical comfort. So what would be the opposite of that? Like, could you turn on the air conditioning, or could you wash your face, or what? So it's like, yeah, it's that kind of you can be much more creative trying to make things bad than trying to make things good, I think. Or like so that is one subset of a bigger thing, which is kind of just screw around with it in some way. And so
I think it's, I was gonna say, like, I think it's all about opening up creativity, because the whole point of creativity is that you're going places that you haven't expected or that you haven't gone before. And so if you're trying to make something good, you're trying to make it good according to a standard that you already have, and so it's extremely narrow. And then anything like enjoyable, basically, like enjoyment comes from the unexpected, whether it's learning things, whether it's a joke or anything. And so if you're making jokes, then it has to be unexpected, and so you have to open up your creativity.
So try to surprise yourself, or tweak some variable that you didn't think of tweaking, or
One
put
of
on.
my yeah, one of the so I was doing this YouTube course over the pandemic.
Mhm.
And I ran into the writer's block like kind of halfway through, and then I kind of didn't make any more videos. But one of the videos I made was just like for the week one homework, and I thought, what's the stupidest thing I could make this on? Because the prompt was my favorite thing, and I was like, that's a
All right.
stupid prompt. I don't want to write. I want to do a video about my favorite thing. And I
Mhm.
thought, okay, I'll do it about my favorite color. And then I like made a video
It was
that I've
nice.
had compliments about.
Yeah, it's great. I
and
love
and
it.
I'm like, what? And that was like, I'll just pick a stupid topic
Mhm.
and have fun with it myself, and
Mhm.
then like do some intellectual wankery, and it
Yeah,
was so much fun.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's beautiful. I think there is, yeah, we all probably take ourselves too seriously. Like there's something about when you kind of give up and then be like, fuck it, I'm just gonna do a nonsense take, and that just brings the joy. Yeah. And you know what? I also want to say, I don't think so there's like an amount of straining and narrowing of focus and like all of that stuff. I don't think that's wasted. I found that um so again, I wouldn't encourage anyone to agonize, but when I look back, all of the agonizing that I've done, like so some people say like, oh, the agonizing I've done was completely unhelpful. But for me, I usually find that I got some value out of it. It's kind of surprising how what turns up. Like my earlier drafts inform my later drafts. Oh, one thing I wanted to make sure to mention was very often when I'm stuck, it's because I have competing perspectives or competing interests, or like the thing that I'm about to say, I also have a disagreement to it. And I found it
Mm.
super helpful to just list out, like introduce both perspectives. And I saw an author, she was a memoir, no, a biographer, the lady who wrote a
I'd
Mhm.
imagine that that would make the writing better as well, because
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
now you're because the reader will also be thinking that.
Exactly. Yeah. There's this great I read a biography of Steven Spielberg, and I was so it's so good that I was so pissed off. I was like, who is this person who wrote so well? And then I looked up her Wikipedia. She's like in her 90s or so. Like she's really old. So she's had decades of experience. I'm like, okay, that's reasonable. And she opens even before the biography starts, she lists out all the things that she says are like reasons why I can't, like so she's like, I'm not a man, I'm not X, I'm not Y. Like she lists out all the things that would potentially disqualify her from writing a good biography of Steven Spielberg, but she does it with such charm and confidence that you're like, oh, come on, man. Like you're even more qualified because you know all of these things. Like you're aware, and like I'm even before I start the biography, I'm like, I'm sold. Like whatever you have to say, I want to read it. And it's that, yeah, it's that willingness to discuss the limits of the thing that you're about to attempt, which I don't know if you necessarily want to include that in every single, like if you're making a YouTube video or in a short essay. Like I don't know if signposting all of that in a lengthy thing at the start is worthwhile. So for a book, it makes sense. But I think just doing it even internally for yourself so that you have a felt sense of it, and then you can like cut it out or ignore it,
Mm.
and that just it changes the tone. There's like a lightness. So I find that I always want to explain myself before writing my essays. And so whenever I start an essay, I'm always explaining myself. I'm like, oh, I've had 5 different things that I want to talk about, and blah, blah. And like it's scaffolding. And if I don't have that scaffolding, it gets muddy, and I lose interest. But when I put the scaffolding there and then I write it, I realize I can remove the scaffolding afterwards, and it looks better without the scaffolding. So I found that helpful.
What do your so when you've got writer's block, and then you kind of do this zooming out thing,
Mhm.
and then um do you ever kind of then go into like a research mode,
Yeah.
or
Like for
and so
this.
like yeah, I'm curious like what your research for your your writings looks like.
So I have like these sprawling ongoing research projects that I don't expect to be done with anytime soon. Like and I think that's actually not very great like project management scoping on my part. So, I want to do a bunch of essays about like historical scenes, and the amount of potential reading there is for that is like, oh, I gotta learn the entire history of Baghdad and Florence and Venice and all those things. And like that's not, you could spend a decade doing all of that reading and not feel like you're confident enough to write anything yet. And I don't want to do that. So um I where I'm at currently, I'm trying to think about having a pace of output that I feel is good enough, interesting enough ish. I try to include, I mean, I try to think about it from the reader's perspective. I mean, so first of all, I have to be having fun as a writer, but I also try to think about it as um, I want to give people like a couple of things they can take away with them that they feel like they didn't waste their time reading a thing. And I mean, they might read it and say, "Oh, that was fun writing," but to read, but like I want to do add something a bit more. I want to have like some perspective, some insight, and yeah, I if I were a bit more deliberate about it, I think I would like structure some time and be like, so next week I want to do an essay about the printing press, and I want to like spend. So if I know I'm going to write that next week, I would like to like kind of luxuriate in the Wikipedia page and watch like a documentary and take some notes and that kind of thing. I very seldom follow that structure though. I tend to just kind of yeah, I tend to just freestyle basically.
On the topic of making it exciting for yourself, instead of like just regurgitating stuff you already know.
Yes.
And like, so there's an issue because like I want to explain like the basics, like the fundamentals, the 101 stuff that I learned like, 10 years ago, whatever, long time ago.
Sure.
Probably closer to 20 anyway, 20 years ago. So and and so I wonder, like, maybe, but when I'm like learning new things, I'm learning new things that like kind of have a lot of, and so because like as you're talking, I was thinking about like my relationship to research, and it's something like I'll have like basically a sort of self-learning plan. Like I'm like, oh, there's this question that I'm interested in, and then there's that topic, and there's this, and then I'll go down all the rabbit holes, and then I'll want to share like the answers that I got like from that recent exploration. And maybe this is like part of the key, which is that if you have new things that you're excited about that you really want to share with people and they take all of that, well, then you just like naturally write anything that is needed to explain the most recent thing, and then actually that makes it kind of more tuned and more dense and more kind of interesting kind of all the way through, because there's this like cool thing that you're currently excited about.
Yes.
And you don't actually like, I think one of the problems that I've had with my writer's block is that I've been trying to just write out the like 101 thing so that I can later on maybe explain other things. Whereas actually, I think possibly if I have a specific other thing that I want to explain, and then I explain the basics, like in order to explain that, then that's going to be more interesting for them, more interesting for me, and would work better.
Yeah. So you're saying explain the 201 thing before you do the 101 thing? Basically.
Yeah, or at least like my own focus being on that, and then being like, okay, well, what are the prerequisites to get to there, and then like, okay, I'll just like dash those off, like I don't even have to think about those because like I've already got my destination in mind.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about like having faith in the readers. So you will lose some people, like, but like, it's good to give them a little bit of a challenge, a little bit of a mystery story, right? Like, so I was talking about something similar with Malcolm, where we were saying, when two friends are having a conversation, and we're kind of doing that right now, right? Like, you can speak at the level of where you and your friend are at, and somebody else witnessing that conversation may think, oh, that person just said something to the other person, and I didn't understand it, but they seem to have understood it. So there's some gap in my knowledge, and like potentially, right? And thoughtful.
This is why the podcast medium is so good.
Exactly. It solves a problem. It's great for it creates that knowledge gap jumping. Like, so in conversation, if people notice that they have a knowledge gap, but they saw that two people kind of crossed it, they can then have faith that they should probably be able to cross it themselves. And it's just great. Yeah, it's great to then start looking things up. And yeah, so really conversation and dialogue as a medium is unmatched at just meeting people, meeting yourself, meeting your partner, and just making sense, right? Like, yeah, so when you try to make sense together with someone, it's actually kind of easier in some ways. And yeah,
I'm wondering if I can like either like message a friend and say like, hey, I want to write this thing. Can I just explain this idea to you? So that's what
yes,
you do
I
basically.
do. Yeah. I highly
Okay.
you can do it to me anytime. I enjoy,
Okay.
like facilitating that process as well, because I always learn stuff even in, so it's so meta, because in trying to help a friend with their writing, I always get something for myself. Like always, there's
Mm.
never been a time where I'm helping someone else and I'm don't be like, shit, I should do that too, like that kind of thing. Because it's,
Yeah.
yeah, there's something about the dynamism between the back and forth that then the solitary thing I was trying to do by myself, I realized, oh, I should, there's this point where I should bounce here and then bounce back, and that's only somehow apparent in conversation.
It's also, I wonder if this is related to why co-working, like working with doing pomodoros with a friend, is just so much nicer
Mhm.
for some reason. For
It
some
is.
reason,
Yeah,
yeah.
I have been doing that recently with a new friend I just met locally, and we go to coffee shops and we sit for like 3 hours, and we take like 1 hour, and then like 50 minutes, 10 minutes, 50 minutes, 10 minutes. And it's like this, I see him typing and I'm like, ooh, like this is serious mode. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I got so much more done than I do sitting at home. Like it's just, it works, man. It just does. Like the something about the sense of, I almost feel like it's a covenant. Like, okay, we're gonna really dive deep in this thing. Like my subconscious kind of plays along with me. And now that the image that's coming to my mind is like, when let's say a parent and a child, and the child is usually kind of very cheeky and silly and mischievous, then the parent's like, hey, we are going to go to this place, and like maybe it's like the parent's boss or someone important or something, and the parent is like, okay, this is serious, I need you to behave. And then the child actually behaves because the child actually believes that the parent actually is serious, and then like everyone's just serious, like, oh, it's serious stuff happening right now. Like there's something like that when I
Mm.
commit to a thing where, like, so normally it's
That
me.
happens to me in groups of adults as well. Like if
Yeah.
there's an event that you're running and people are
Mm.
getting a bit rowdy, then you can just put on like, okay, now we have to be serious, and then like people are just like they just copy
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. It's
Mirror neurons, man.
it works. Yeah. It's a kind of commitment device, I guess. Yeah, and that brings me to, I mean, it's not directly relevant, but I've just been thinking a lot about that. Like, I almost feel like I have been lacking ceremony in my life, like just very intentional. I freestyle a lot and I'm good at it, but I don't do enough. Like, oh, like, so me and my wife, we hang out at home together all the time, and we like improvise. Let's just go whatever. And I'm like, we should dress up and go out and
Yeah.
like really be deliberate about it. It seems like a lot of effort, but it kind of evokes mental states that you don't access otherwise.
Oh man, like during the pandemic, I was just in my pajamas all day. But every time, I had a shower in the morning and I got dressed as if I was going out, I
Right.
just felt better.
Yeah, it
Like being
works.
in pajamas all day actually just was kind of draining for some
It
reason.
is. It really is. Yeah, it's, oh man, like comfort does have diminishing returns. And past a certain point, you become uncomfortable in your comfort. And it's like, you need some dynamic excitement, some kind of like this. And the silliest thing in my life is that every so often I have to relearn what should be, I feel like should be obvious, but like sometimes I feel like I'm too tired to exercise, and every time I've exercised when I'm tired, I'm like, oh, I got all this energy now. Like
Yeah,
what?
yeah, yeah.
Like it's so silly, but I hope I'll internalize it sometime at some point.
Yeah.
Anything else you got, or would you like
I was
to?
about to ask you the same
Right, it
question,
feels it
so
feels like a
let's call it a
nice.
wrap.
This is
Yeah.
great. This was so much fun. See,
Yeah.
I got stuff out of this conversation. I
Me
can't
too.
tell you exactly what, but I feel like writing more than I felt like 2 hours ago. Like just
I will I
from
will I will tweet about what I got from it
ah,
after this gets uploaded.
I'm gonna upload it straight away.
Okay,
All right.
awesome.
Thanks so much for
All
hanging
right.
out. Let me end the recording first.